Hello, my name is Anitsu, and I'm back with another Digimon budget deck profile video. So today I'm covering the red budget deck that you could make in Special Booster 1.0. There's technically two variants of the deck. There's one with the starter deck and one without the starter deck. And I think the Special Booster 1.0 red, yellow, and blue were all designed with having the starter deck in mind. So I definitely feel like with the starter deck, the deck is going to be a lot better. But we still have enough cards to make a deck out of, even if we don't have the starter deck in Special Booster 1.0. I'll be covering both decks in this video, and starting with the deck without starter deck cards. We're going to be running 4 copies of Bebydomon, because Bebydomon is just the cheapest Digitama that we could get, because he's an uncommon, and on top of which, his inheritable ability really isn't that bad, because while the Digimon has piercing, then it gets plus 2000 DP, so this is just a pretty decent DP buff if the Digimon has piercing. Next, as far as the rookies go, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Monodramon, because Monodramon is just that value-efficient rookie. I'm going to be running 2 copies of Agumon, so you don't necessarily have to run Agumon if you really don't want to. I just think that this card is really good for the deck just because he has a nice unplayability to check the top 5 and add any tamer among them into your hand, and then the rest go to the bottom. Next, I'm running 4 copies of Biyomon, because Biyomon has a really nice inheritable ability where during your turn, if this Digimon gets blocked, then it gets plus 2000 DP. So she's just doing some more DP boosting in a little bit different way. And then the last rookie of the deck is going to be 4 copies of Guilmon, because Guilmon is another DP booster. His ability is a little bit more generic and neutral as compared to Biyomon, where during your turn, if the opponent has 5 or more cards in their trash, then this Digimon gets plus 1000 DP. So just more DP boosting, which is pretty good. Next, on to the champions. I'm running 4 copies of Kokatorimon. So Kokatorimon is a pretty interesting card because he has a very, very low play cost, and that's really the big thing on why we're looking to play the card, because for a champion, he has basically the play cost of a rookie, and that's just pretty solid. Next, I'm running 4 copies of Greymon. So Greymon is pretty good because he has another inheritable skill of just a DP boosting by 2000, so that's just pretty decent. And then the last champion of the deck is going to be 4 copies of DarkTyrannomon. So DarkTyrannomon is really important to the deck just because he has this at very, very low Evo cost. And that's really all we're looking to gain out of the card, is just Evoing him for 1, so that way we could get into our higher stages a lot more efficiently. Next, onto the ultimates, I'm running 4 copies of Groundramon. So Groundramon is, again, another value-efficient card. He has a very low play cost for his level, very low Digivolution cost for his level, and that's really all we're looking to gain out of this card, is just use him to get into our megas very, very efficiently. And then the last ultimate of the deck is going to be 4 copies of MetalTyrannomon. So MetalTyrannomon is a pretty interesting Digimon just because he is a ultimate with a whole lot of DP, and we could start aggroing with him a little bit early just because of his high DP. We're not necessarily super afraid to swing into the opponent's security with him, especially if he is DP boosted with any of our Digimon that, DP boost. Next, on to our megas. I'm running 4 copies of Breakdramon. So Breakdramon is the main mega of the deck because he has this piercing ability innately, where when this Digimon attacks and deletes another opponent's Digimon and survives, then you get to perform a security check. So he combos really, really nicely with our Digitama Bebydomon, and then on top of which, we have a whole bunch of other DP boosters. So he can become a very, very hard Digimon for the opponent to stop, and if they even think about blocking him, then again, piercing will still just deal the damage to the opponent. So he's just a very powerful and very aggressive card for the deck. And then the last mega that we're going to be running in the deck is 4 copies of Volcanicdramon. So Volcanicdramon is pretty powerful because it has 2 really important abilities. The first ability it has is Security Attack +1, so when he attacks, he'll be able to deal an extra security check, which is, again, very, very powerful, especially since we have a whole bunch of ways to DP boost him if we want to Digivolve up into him. but if we don't want to Digivolve up into him, he has a very powerful on-play ability where we get to delete all of the opponent's Digimon with 4000 DP or less. So he just clears the field of all of the small things, and then he'll still have that security attack +1 if we just want to play him just to play him. But if we want to Digivolve him up, he's still pretty good because of that security attack +1. Next, on to the options. I'm running 2 copies of Gravity Crush. So Gravity Crush is a pretty interesting option card, considering it allows you to just gain 2 memory that costs 0. So gaining 2 memory is pretty solid because it could help you play some more of your cards and extend a lot of your plays. But the only drawback is you have to give back that 2 memory that you essentially borrowed. So depending on the setup, this card could be really good. It could be really mediocre, but that's why we're running 2 of it, just because it's still a very solid option that you could possibly run. Next, I'm running 3 copies of Shield of Just as the last option card of the deck. So Shield of Just is a pretty solid option card where it has a main ability of deleting one of the opponent's Digimon with 5000 DP or less. And then if we have a Tamer in play, then we get to delete one with 8000 or less instead. So this is basically our big removal card for the deck, just because it is still a very, very powerful removal card, and it has a nice security effect of activating its main effect. And then lastly, we're running 3 copies of Tai Kamiya as the only Tamer of the deck. This Tai Kamiya is the memory fixing Tai Kamiya because memory fixing is pretty solid, where if our memory is 2 or less, we get to set it to 3. And then during our turn, all of our red Digimon with 4 or more Digivolution sources get security attack +1. So if we have a fully built up Breakdramon, then he's going to be hitting for 2 security. And if we have a fully built up Volcanicdramon and Digivolved up into it, then he's going to be hitting for 3 security. So just the extra security check is pretty good, and we need to run this card to make Shield Adjust even better. So it's not a bad card to have for the deck overall. Next, in terms of what the deck would look like if you did have a starter deck, for the most part, the deck is going to be mostly the same, using mostly the same cards. So instead of using Bebydomon as the main Digitama, we're going to be using Koromon as the main Digitama, just because Koromon has a really nice ability of during your turn, if this Digimon has 4 more Digivolution sources, then it gets +1000 DP. So this is just a little bit more generically neutral, so in case we are running other Megas, it just synergizes just more neutrally, which is why you'd prefer this over Bebydomon, because Bebydomon is a little bit more specific in its buff. We're still going to be running Agumon, we're still going to be running Guilmon. You could swap out Monodramon with the starter deck Biyomon. They're basically the same card, so they're doing the exact same thing. It's just if you have the starter deck, you don't need to spend the money on the Monodramon, just because Biyomon, again, is doing the exact same thing. And then we're going to be adding in the 4 copies of the Agumon. So the Agumon from the starter deck is probably going to be replacing the Biyomon, just because Agumon's DP buff is a little bit more generic and a little bit more neutral, which makes it a lot more better to play, just because it can synergize with just a lot more cards in general. Then we're still going to be running DarkTyrannomon, and we're going to be cutting down on the booster set Greymon, but we are going to be running 4 copies of Groundramon, because Groundramon comes in the starter deck as a 4 of, and he is the blocker of the deck, and having a blocker is still pretty important. And then we are going to be adding in the 2 copies of the Greymon that come in 1 copy of the starter deck. This Greymon is pretty good just because he gives security attack +1, so it allows you to deal a lot of potential extra damage. But because the starter deck only comes with 2 copies, I'm only going to be adding in 2 copies. But obviously, if you get more copies of this Greymon, then he is just the better Greymon over the booster set Greymon. We're still going to be running Groundramon, but we're going to be swapping out MetalTyrannomon with Metal Greymon. So Metal Greymon is pretty good from the starter deck because he has a very nice inheritable ability where when this Digimon is blocked, then you gain +3 memory. So having an ability versus having a more aggressive Digimon is kind of like the big trade-up. You could just run MetalTyrannomon still, but I just think Metal Greymon is a little bit better just because we have a good toolbox of Megas that we want to utilize, and some of them can be very, very devastating for the opponent. So I just feel like having the ability is better than not. Speaking of our Megas, we're going to be still playing Breakdramon, but we're going to be reducing him just because we have the Megas from the starter deck that we want to be playing. So Breakdramon is still a pretty solid Digimon, again, piercing. Same thing with Volcanicdramon. We're still going to be running it just in a lower quantity because Digimon from the starter deck. And then the Digimon from the starter deck in terms of megas that we're going to be adding in, or would be adding in if we had the starter deck, is the 2 copies of Phoenixmon that the starter deck comes with. So Phoenixmon is pretty good just because it has some slightly higher DP than some of the other ones, on top of which it has a very low Evo cost. So it's very easy to just build up into a Phoenixmon and start attacking at the opponent's security and doing some damage really quickly. And then we're also going to be running 2 copies of the War Greymon from the starter deck. So obviously if you have more versions of the starter deck, the deck is going to be changing. But I'm just only going into the assumption that you have 1 starter deck, and it only comes with 2 copies of this War Greymon and 2 copies of Phoenixmon. But regardless, this War Greymon is still pretty good because he has a very, very powerful ability where during your turn, for every 2 Digivolution cards in his Digivolution source, he gains Security Tech +1. So if he is a fully built card, he'll have basically Security Tech +2. So he's going to be hitting for 3 security, and then if you build him correctly with the Greymon in his source, then he's going to be hitting for 4 security. And then with our tamer, Tai, he could be hitting for all 5 of the security all at once. So War Greymon is just a very, very powerful card just to hit very, very hard, and we're not necessarily super afraid of him dying because we do have a whole bunch of DP boosters to just increase his DP. In terms of how the options go, we are still going to be running Shield of the Just at a slightly lower quantity, just because the starter deck does come with 2 copies of Gaia Force, and Gaia Force is still just a very, very powerful card, and Shield of the Just is basically just our alternate removal card to act as filler for the Gaia Forces. And then we're still going to be running the Tamer, but we could run the Tamer in a higher quantity, just because we still need to see the Tamer for Shield Adjust, but because we have so many different megas that we just want to have increase in their damage output, then Tai Kamiya is still a very, very powerful card because his ability does stack, where if you have multiple of them out, then you will get multiple instances of getting the extra security tech +1. So it could turn almost all of your megas into very hard-hitting megas on the opponent's security. And this is kind of why we want to run cards like MetalTyrannomon, where he just rewards you if they try to block your attacks. So you could play around with some of the ratios. You could probably just end up cutting the Phoenixmon for more Breakdramon or Volcanicdramon if you want. If you get another version of the starter deck, then you obviously would want to add in more Gaia Force and more Greymon. And you could also think about adding in more of the War Greymon. So the deck has a whole bunch of different ways that you could play it, and it has a whole lot of flexibility based on what you have access to. But for the most part, it's still a very, very solid deck with or without the starter deck cards. And then in terms of other cards you could run with the deck, you could run Taiga. So if you're playing the variant without the starter deck cards, then you could run Taiga because Taiga has some really good synergy with Piercing. So he makes Bebydomon better, and we are still going to be running a whole bunch of Tyrannomon. Even though we're not running any of the green Tyrannomon, that doesn't necessarily matter because we still have the red Tyrannomons that he interacts with, and he's still going to be very, very potent in that. So Taiga just forms his own budget Tyrannomon build if you want to go that direction. And then if you're continuing with that direction, again, you would just want to play the other Tyrannomon because he just synergizes with Tyrannomons. And then again, with a whole bunch of our DP boosters, then it just makes our Tyrannomons that much more dangerous, especially this Tyrannomon because this Tyrannomon has jamming. So that's just pretty powerful because he won't die to security checks, on top of which Taiga would give him Piercing, Bebydomon would give him a DP buff, and if they do even think about blocking him, then you could have something like Biyomon in its Inheritable to just continue to boost him even further and make sure that you get your damage across. So, the Tyrannomon is a very solid budget deck. I'll go over that in probably a separate video, but that is definitely one direction you could take the deck. You could also think about running Skull Greymon. Skull Greymon's pretty good as a good splash card, just because his on-play ability to delete one of the opponent's Digimon with blocker is still pretty good. If the opponent doesn't have any blocker, then he's not like super amazing. He's just like basically a vanilla card, but if they do have a blocker, then he is very good at removing them. Then you could also think about running Groundmon, because Groundmon's inheritable ability is just a pretty good statically, where on attack you get to delete one of your opponent's Digimon with 2000 DP or less. And then you could also think about running War Groundmon. So War Groundmon is pretty good because of his two abilities. His when Digivolving ability to just pop something that's 3000 DP or less as long as you have a red tamer in play is pretty solid. On top of which, he also just will DP boost whatever mega you're digivolving him into because of his inheritable ability, where while the opponent has 5 or more cards in their trash, then this Digimon will gain plus 1000 DP. So he's just a very solid option overall of another ultimate you could use. If you want, you could also still think about using the starter deck Tai Kamiya if you have the starter deck or access to it, because this is just a pretty cheap tamer to kind of get your effects with like Shield Adjust and Warp Groundmon online, on top of which it's just a generically DP boosting all of your Digimon, so it makes it a little bit harder for the opponents to deal with your Digimon. Then if you have access to any of the promo pack 0.0, then this Biyomon is a really good card because it gives a nice inheritable ability where it just combos and synergizes with destroying the opponent's Digimon by battle, and then it rewards you for doing that by drawing you a card. So this synergizes really well with like Breakdramon, where it wants to attack into the opponent's Digimon, and then when it does that, then you're going to be drawing cards off of it, and drawing cards is very good and very powerful. And then if you want, you could run Yokomon as the Digitama for either of the builds. Yokomon is just a pretty solid Digitama in her own right, where she just gives a nice inheritable ability of when attacking one of your opponent's Digimon, this Digimon gets plus 1000 DP. So it kind of is rewarding you for like that whole piercing strategy. It's just you don't need to have piercing to get some DP bonuses. So Yokomon is just a pretty solid card for just giving you some DP boosting. So for the most part, this is just kind of what a right budget deck is doing with and without the starter deck cards. It's a really interesting and really solid deck, and I definitely think you could get quite some decent mileage out of it because you don't necessarily have to invest too heavily on any of the rares, and you definitely have a lot of flexibility in some of the different options of different tech cards that you want to use based on what you can get and what you have access to. For the most part, that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. And I'll see you in the next video.